Right, so take a simple example that doesn't have anything specifically to do with the theories of consciousness. Take colors, right? So we can make a fairly strong case for the claim that colors aren't there in the world independent of us because they only get generated through the interaction of stuff out there with our particular visual system and the way our eyes works and our brain works and so on, right? So there isn't anything out there in the world that is red. Rather, redness is a quality that arises from the interaction of something out there in the world, say wavelengths of lights or what have you, and our specific perceptual system, right? So if you took us and say all perceivers out of the world, then there would be no colors and there would be no redness.
Jan Westerhoff is Professor of Buddhist Philosophy in the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford. He has specific interests in metaphysics and in the philosophy of early Indian Buddhist thinkers. He's written many books, including The Non-Existence of the Real World, 12 Examples of Illusion, and Reality, a very short introduction. So welcome, Jan Westerhoff, to our discussion today. I want to talk about reality, Jan, and I want to begin, if I may, with Descartes, because I believe it was Poincaré which made the comment that the man in the street, the ordinary person, is a Cartesian dualist. In other words, they believe, and most people believe, they've got a mind and they've got a body. And my question to you is, what's wrong with that? Let's call it the naive view.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything specifically wrong with that as a first pass. I would be surprised, though, if the majority of people really consider themselves to be Cartesian dualists nowadays. I would think most people are materialists and they think, well, they have a body and the brain, and somehow the brain generates their mind. And when they die and the brain disappears, then they will disappear too. Because if you are a Cartesian dualist, then you have to believe not only that that is all wrong, but that there are two different kind of substances. There is your physical body, and that is the physical substance. And then there is another substance, which is a mental substance, which is you. And in you as a person, these two substances are somehow conjoined. And then, of course, the million-dollar question is how they can interact. And I mean that is one of the main problems that the Cartesian dualist has to solve. And if you want to start criticizing that position, that is usually where it starts. Where you ask yourself, okay, so how something that is physical interact with something that is non-physical? Because all the interactions that we see in the physical world is some physical stuff acting on other physical stuff. Yeah? So that is really what you think is unsatisfactory about the Cartesian position. But I think as a position on reality, I would be surprised if we find that many people who still believe that inside them is an indestructible, non-physical substance that is their mind.
I would think that all the religious people would think that, certainly. And there's what I saw a statistic the other day, 1.4 billion Christians and another 1.3 billion Muslims, and then the others. They would all probably be, I would guess, Cartesian dualists because of their religion. But certainly I would say that most philosophers, most thinkers, and most university people would all be materialists, nearly all of them. And I wondered, and that suggests then that everything is made up of matter. It's made up of particles and fields, maybe, gluons, partons, whatever they may be. And therefore the mind is somehow a mere phenomenon that comes out of this interaction of matter. Is that a good picture? Does that work?
Yeah. Well, that's a complex question, and it's on the one hand, the answer is it gets us very far because we can explain a lot about how the mind works by insight into how the brain works, right? So on various mental functions, we can explain how they're generated by the brain and so on. Now, the question is whether that explanation gets us all the way and allows us to explain the entirety of consciousness. And that is an entirely different question. And there things get a lot more murky. So one problem that is, I think, interesting to consider in this context is that if you conceive of the world and yourself as something that your brain generates, so that when you are basically living in a kind of simulated reality that is generated by your brain and of course from input through the physical senses, then you're immediately faced with the problem that the entire setup that generates that virtual reality, namely the brain and everything else, is also part of the model or of the virtual reality itself, right? So you are suddenly, through this kind of neurobiological reduction, you seem to be trapped in a loop, right? Where you say you are that the world surrounding you is a simulation of your brain, and your brain is a part of the world, and therefore that is part of the simulation too. So then, of course, the question is to which extent that still is a stable position, and there can be different views on that. Some people think it is, but in any case, it is far from straightforward what position you should then take regarding the reality of the brain as a physical substance.
So if you do take that as the view, though, that surely implies that the mind is really just an illusion. It's a very clever illusion, and we think that we've got a mind, but the reality is that we haven't. Is that?
Yeah, of course, that then depends on what you mean by illusion. So if by illusion you mean something that reduces to something else, then you'd say, okay, well, in that case, the mind is an illusion. If you say an illusion is something that isn't really there, that doesn't really exist, then that doesn't necessarily follow, because in that setup, you still have the appearance of a mind, and that is presumably doing something, and that is there. So the existence and the presence of the appearance seems to be pretty undoubtable. I mean, there are people who worry about that as well, and you get this kind of illusionism about consciousness, where the idea is that that is simply illusory as well. But if you, for a moment, stick to the fact that consciousness at least appears to you, then of course the next question that arises is, okay, so that might well be reducible to something else. So that is reducible to physical phenomena, but that doesn't mean that it's not there. It doesn't have anything specifically to do with the theories of consciousness. Take colors, right? So we can make a fairly strong case for the claim that colors aren't there in the world independent of us, because they only get generated through the interaction of stuff out there with our particular visual system and the way our eyes works and our brain works and so on, right? So there isn't anything out there in the world that is red. Rather, redness is a quality that arises from the interaction of something out there in the world, say wavelengths of lights or what have you, and our specific perceptual system, right? So if you took us and say all perceivers out of the world, then there would be no colors and there would be no redness, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that once you have a human being, say, nothing is colored, because you still have the appearance of color, and it just reduces to something else. It is, in fact, not some kind of primitive quality, but it's something that only arises as a complex interaction from some stuff that is outside and from some stuff that is inside. So to that extent, on the one hand, yes, red is illusory insofar as it reduces to something else, but it's not illusory insofar as it still appears.
Right. Let me try to clarify my question a bit when I talk about something being illusory and whether the mind is illusory. I'm referring really to the idea of epiphenomenalism, which my understanding, and I'm not a philosopher, but my understanding of it is that matter produces the idea of a mind
Mhm.
rather as a kind of a byproduct. And the way that you can see this quite clearly is that um, if it's merely epiphenomenal, if it's a phenomenon of matter, then the mind doesn't actually cause anything to happen.
Mhm.
Rather, it's the matter which causes the mind to happen. So if I say I'm going to make my hand raise in the air like I just did, I think to myself, my mind was doing that. But the reality is that the mind doesn't cause anything. It was determined by some laws of physics, maybe back before the beginning of the world, as it just playing itself out. And it was determined by some laws or other that that's exactly what would happen at this particular time. The mind didn't cause it, but rather the materialism was the cause of things.
Mhm.
Does
Yeah,
that make
yeah, that's right. So the idea with phenomenalism is that you have some sort of underlying base reality, say material reality here, and then you've got some other phenomenon sort of sits on top. So that's the epiphenomenon, right? And the important point about that scenario is that causal relations only go one way, right? So it's only going up from the basis to the epiphenomenon. It's causing the stuff, but there's nothing going down. Yeah. So
That's what I meant by illusion.
yeah,
We think that it's going down, but it
yeah,
doesn't in reality.
right. Yeah. So uh, yeah, I'm not sure whether that is a good conception in general to think of things being illusory, because we have many examples where illusions have causal power, right? So just take two at random, say, assuming you dream of some kind of imaginary scenario, you're in a jungle and being chased by a tiger. You lie in your bed sleeping whilst you dream that, but because of that dream, your heart rate goes up, right? Because of the stress and the adrenaline rush being chased by a tiger, right? Okay, so here you'd think, well, what is happening? Well, your mind is or your brain is generating the dream, but then the dream has consequences on the state of your physical body as you're lying in bed, right? So it seems to be the case that even though it's illusory, it has causal powers. Now, uh, take another example. You see a mirage in the desert that is presumably an illusion. There is no water there, but the uh, illusion itself might have all kinds of causal powers that generates specific actions. For example, you might walk into that direction because you see the water over there rather than in the other direction, right? So it's causing something to happen even though it is only illusory. Yeah. So the claim that if something is an illusion, then it doesn't do anything, or it isn't involved in causal processes or can't cause uh, any phenomena, is perhaps not the best way of getting to a general idea of what it means for something to be not real or something to be illusory.
Okay. So what would you say the mind is? I mean, how should we understand it? As you say, most people most philosophers seem to take a materialistic point of view.
Mhm.
Therefore, what is the status of the mind and consciousness correspondingly?
Right. Well, you have, of course, two obvious opposed positions on the table here, or perhaps three, with Cartesian dualism being in the middle. On the one hand, you have the materialist position where matter or the brain generates the mind. Then on the other hand, you've got the idealist extreme where you say, okay, it's all really mental, and this then generates the appearance of matter. And then, of course, you've got sort of dualist house positions where you say, well, there's both material stuff and there's mental stuff, and then you somehow have to generate some kind of interaction between the two in order to see how it works, right? So I'm personally, I'm not a fan of either of these three positions. In particular, as they both of those, all three of those, assume some kind of foundationalism. They assume that you have some sort of base reality that is really there, and that is fundamental, and on which everything rests. And then you've got all the other stuff that is generated from that. Yeah. So I'm more interested in, and also more convinced by accounts according to which you have all these kinds of different things and they condition one another, right? So you've got mental things and you've got physical things, and none of them is reducible to another thing, but they depend on each other in complex ways. So it is the brain that generates the mental stuff, but then of course, without the mental stuff, we certainly don't have any epistemic way to any material, right? So without us having a mind, there is no way that the world as it appears to us would appear to us, right? So these two seem to be connected in sort of complex interactions and mutual dependence. And in which case, it wouldn't be the case that you can simply reduce one to some kind of foundation and then everything else sits on top of that reduction base.
So would you say that there is no ultimate foundation? I mean, I was trained as a physicist, and we started off saying that there were such things as molecules. And then we reduced the molecules down to atoms and elements. And then we reduced those down to nuclei and protons. And then below those, we found that there might be quarks and there might be gluons. And there may be things below those as well.
Yeah.
But this is rather like that philosophical answer saying that everything sits on the back of the elephant, and then the elephant sits on the back of the turtle, and what's below the turtle? And it goes on and on. Maybe it's turtles all the way down, but or are you saying there isn't a picture like that? That picture is a fake or false picture, and we shouldn't be beguiled by it.
Yeah, so you see, there are basically two alternatives to the kind of foundationalist picture that you've just presented. So on the foundational system, you've got some sort of rock bottom other material, rock bottom or some kind of mental, rock bottom of stuffs that is just brute, is just there. There's no further explanation for it, and then everything sits on top of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've got some kind of dependence base, and dependence relations are reduced to that. Now there are two different alternatives to that picture. One is the one you've just mentioned, where it's dependence all the way down, right? So for every base layer, you can find a more fundamental base layer. That one depends on, and that one depends on, and that one depends on, right? And that is if you want to say have a simple model of that, you consider the negative natural numbers, -1, -2, -3, and so on. They go all the way back, and for every negative number, you can find another one that is smaller, and you never reach the end of that sequence. Yeah? But that isn't a problem. I mean, you don't have to think, well, for all these negative numbers to be there and for one of them to be smaller than another one, there has to be a smallest negative number that sits at the bottom of at the end of the chain, right? There isn't. It goes all the way back. Yeah. So this is in the same way you could think, okay, well, it's dependence all the way around, all the way back, and there isn't a fundamental dependence level. Okay, so that is one possibility. The other possibility is to say, well, it is basically a huge circle, right? So the dependence relations go all the way around, and so A depends on B and B depends on C and so on, and you get a really big arc, and in the end, it closes back on itself, right? Now, if that circle is really big, then it might look to your limited perspective like a line, because you don't actually see the other end and where it closes back on itself. But it might nevertheless be a kind of circular dependent structure, right? So those are the two main alternative models that you can that you can oppose to this kind of foundationalist system. And I think they're both quite interesting, both intrinsically and also because they haven't gotten that much airtime in metaphysics and ontology until relatively recently, because people were often worried and said, okay, well, isn't there, in the case of the infinite descent, isn't that just an infinite regress, which is going to lead us to a contradiction somewhere? And the similar way with the circularity, right? You think you'll end up with something that ends up somewhere in saying, A and not A, and then you've got a problem. But I think people are now fairly clear that this is not the case, and that these structures are all consistent in the same way in which the foundationalist system is consistent, meaning that you can't derive a contradiction from them. And then the interesting question is, which ones work best in order to explain what we want to explain, right? And then you can say, well, if for example, you consider the example of the body and the mind, then you have these various foundationalist systems, and all of them come with specific problems and specific difficulties. And then you think, okay, well, perhaps we can solve the issue better by considering other possible structural approaches in which this could work. So either this kind of infinite descent of dependence relations, or a kind of circular structure where it's not that everything depends on some fundamental basis, but where you have a mutual interdependence of things in a complex structure and in a kind of web where you also get closed loops or circles.
This has implications for the whole program, really, of theoretical physics or physics itself. Because over the past 50 years or so, there's been a great push to obtain what might be called the grand unified theory, which means to be able to explain everything in terms of some fundamental elements, particularly to unite gravity and Einstein's general theory with quantum mechanics, because they don't seem to fit terribly well together. But they're looking for a grand theory which will sit below that, and then will explain everything. Now, would you say that such a quest, the actual program itself, is doomed to failure even before the search begins?
Well, I don't think as a philosopher I really should pontificate about
Well, who else could?
projects in physics. I mean, I could, but I don't think this is a very, very sensible route to take. Look, I mean, there are lots of different theoretical approaches that are explored in physics, in particular when it comes to thinking about the very foundations of reality. Some of which are foundationalist, some of which are relationist, and so on. And what works in the end, only time will tell. I think what is important at this stage is to be aware of the variety of different structures that reality might have. So to make sure that we at least have a more or less comprehensive coverage of the way things could be, and that's certainly the kind of foundationalist approach, which is in many ways the most natural one, where you think, okay, well, nature is made just like a Lego structure out of Legos, and all we have to do is break it down until we reach the smallest bricks, and then we can rebuild up everything from there. That is not the only way we could explain things. Yeah? And then whether the alternative approaches work better and so on. This is of course a question which is then subject to empirical confirmation, not simply armchair theorizing.
So how do we determine? Let me put the question this way: how do we determine, or is there a criterion of demarcation between what is real and what is not real? One tends to think building blocks, whatever they are, they would be elements of reality as such. But then the question that you're posing really is, what is there a difference between the real and the unreal? Can we decide, what category something falls into? This is a category of being in the real camp, and this is a category of a not real thing. Does such a criterion exist?
Yeah, there are various, in fact, there are various criteria here that you can appeal to, and some of which are, of course, more suitable or useful than others. So if you start at the most basic level, you could say, well, um, what is real is whatever appears to you, and that's not very satisfactory because all kinds of illusory stuff can appear to you. And you might make that a bit more rigorous by saying, okay, so what is real is what appears to more than one person, right? So if I have an hallucination, I can ask my neighbor whether he sees the same thing that I think when I see a pink elephant floating in the sky. And if they see it too, then perhaps I'm more convinced that there really is a pink elephant floating in
Of
the
course,
sky.
you're assuming there is a neighbor as part of that reality. I mean,
Right.
we're really back to Descartes here, aren't we? You know,
Yeah.
the cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore, and that's the only reality that I can be assured of. The only thing which I can be confident that really does exist is myself because I think.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure whether uh, well, whether that is even getting us all we want to get. I mean, even quite early on, Lichtenberg made the point that he thinks, well, all he can really get at this stage is that there's thinking going on, right? Whether there's a subject that does the thinking is, of course, already an inference. At least you can have some kind of process, but whether the process comes with a subject. Is not so clear. Um, yeah, so getting back to different ways of defining this kind of
Yeah.
division between the illusory and reality. So intersubjective agreement is not a very good demarcation either, simply because you can have collective delusions or collective hallucinations where people all see the same illusory thing. So I think we're getting somewhat into more interesting territory when we are thinking of Dr. Johnson's story and the stone, when he try to refute Berkeley idealism by kicking a stone and saying, "I refute it thus." What is meant there is, of course, that what is real puts some kind of pushback to our desires and our wishes, right? So we might want to be able to put our hand through the wall, but when we do that, we realize there's obstruction there, and that shows us that the wall is real and not illusory. Yeah. Um,
But
Now,
that's one of many definitions of reality that you provide in your book, Reality, don't you?
yes, that is one. This is one way of thinking about it. I don't think it's certainly better than the last two I've just discussed, but it's also not quite there simply because you can be in situations where reality pushes back and you're still in an illusory situation. So you might be in a dream, or you might be playing a video game and manipulating characters, and you want to do something and that doesn't work because the game is not programmed that way, and so on. So just the fact that you've got some sort of pushback doesn't mean that you are not in some kind of illusory scenario. So I think the two main criteria that really work much better are one of which we've already talked about is in terms of dependence chains. So when we say, okay, so if something depends on another thing, for example, like an effect depends on its cause, or like a structure that is made of parts depends on its parts, then what is real is what you get when you go down the dependence chain, right? So if you trace back the chain of causes, you get to the further you go back, the more and more real it get. Or if you trace a thing back to its parts, then the parts are more real than the whole. So in putting it a bit more abstract, you would want to say, well, what is real is where all these dependence chains stop, right? Whether these are part-whole dependencies or causal dependencies and so on, you trace them back to their source, and that's what is real, and everything else is really just a construction from that. So that is one way of conceiving of what is real and what is merely appearance. Another way that I think we've also alluded to, at least, is mind independence, right? So if you imagine you took all of the observers, all humans or animals, and everything that has a mind out of the universe, and then you ask yourself, okay, so what would be left? And all of that is left, that is real, and everything else is just a mind-made construct, right? So to that extent, you would want to say, well, if you take all these perceivers out, then certainly all colors would be gone, and all smells, and all tastes, and perhaps moral properties, and so on and so on. But that presumably still, electrons and atoms and so on. So to that extent, you have really two criteria, I think, that are really fundamental in this discussion about what is real and what is not. One is mind independence, and the second one is where the dependence chain stops.
There's a third element there, because I think Berkeley would have said that even if you take all the humans out, so there is no mind to perceive, there's still the mind of God which maintains everything in the background.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if that's a red herring on this particular.
Well, I mean, you see that is that was essential for Berkeleyan idealism, because if you reduce everything to ideas in minds, then you might not want to reduce it just to ideas in my mind and in your mind, but you need something more fundamental or less subjective and even less intersubjective than that, and that is the mind of God for in the Berkeleyan system, right?
Other than of course the idea that if you take that to its logical extreme, then you end up with what's called solipsism, don't you? That's the idea that only minds exist, but really only my mind exists, and there is nothing else in the entire universe other than me.
Mm-hmm.
You've
Yeah,
written about that. What's your view of solipsism as a coherent philosophical view?
yeah, that's quite interesting. I mean, this is of course the uh, logical extreme of an idealist position, right? So you first of all you start with the world with stuff in it, and then you reduce it all to mind, and then you ask yourself, okay, well, but other people, of course, like you and so on, they are external objects as well. And if I got rid of the table and the chair and say that's just mental, then you are just mental too, but you're just mental in my mind, right? And so then everything gets shrunk together into one mind, and then you might say to yourself, okay, so the only thing that's really real is me and my ideas and stuff that's happening in my mind, and then you've got the solipsist conception. Now, of course, this is usually not regarded as a very plausible or attractive philosophical position. So
Well, apparently there are no philosophers who take this view. Apparently,
well, I mean, there should only be one, of
there
course.
should only be one, but we don't know who it is.
Yeah.
Which is a figment of their imagination, I suppose. Apparently, one person, according to John Zell, wrote to Bertrand Russell and said that I am a solipsist, I've discovered, and I'm so happy about it. And I don't know why more people aren't that way inclined, but
Or join the Solipsist Society. Um, yeah, so I mean, take into account though that when we think about our arguments for why there are actually other minds than our own minds, we usually use an argument from analogy, right? So how do I know that you have a mind? Well, I see that you have a body and that you carry out certain behavior, and say you speak and you raise your hand and things like that. And then I think, okay, so probably you are more or less like me. And so when I raise my hand, there is just before that, there's some stuff going on in my mind, my intention to raise my hand. So I think when you are raising your hand, it's probably the case that there's something happening in your mind as well, because I don't make you raise your hands. I just see your hand going up. So I assume by analogy, you being more or less like me, that there's also something going on in your mind. Yeah. So that's usually the argument, how we can infer that other people around us are not zombies, but that they actually have minds. Yeah? Now, this inferential rule is, of course, open to the solipsist, right? I mean, he or she can also think that, well, by analogy, I assume that there are other people with other minds, precisely on the basis of the same data that we get as well, right? So even if we think for various reasons that solipsism is an unsatisfactory position, it's still the case that we don't have direct access to anybody's mind either, right? I can't look into your mind and see that you have one. I can only infer it. And the way I infer it would be exactly the same mechanism that a solipsist could use in order to infer that there are other minds. Yeah. So the existence of other minds is really something which it comes at the end of a chain of inference. It's not a piece of data that we could just take.
So solipsism cannot be refuted, is what you're saying. Whatever evidence is presented, nothing can actually refute it. You simply have to either believe it or not, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's the question is, of course, whether that's usually the way you pick or decide between different philosophical positions, right? So, and there's an interesting passage in Robert Nozick where he's wondering about that and says, okay, so what does it actually take to refute a philosophical argument? And of course, few philosophers are convinced by arguments that try to refute what they believe. And you think, okay, well, the best thing would be a kind of, philosophical argument that if somebody if you present the proof to them and they don't see how, they don't agree to it, then their mind explodes, right? So this is, the ultimate refutation. So if you don't agree to the argument, then you die. Now, that is, of course, not how it works in philosophy, and I certainly haven't come across an argument that would be that powerful. Usually what you say is you have various philosophical views that can explain certain phenomena, and all of them come with explanatory benefits, things they can explain, and they come with costs. So there's certain assumptions you have to make in order to get the theory to go, right? And what you do is usually you try to do some kind of weighing between the things you need to accept, so the philosophical costs of the view, and what it delivers, the benefits, what it can explain. Yeah, and then you will find a lot of people saying, well, I mean, with kind of solipsism, it's just not such an attractive position, right? I'm just not willing to make the kinds of assumptions that you need to make in order to take these positions. And I think I wouldn't really assume that it's a particularly either interesting or explanatory position to take on reality, to think is, well, just sort of spinning out of my mind. Yeah. So that's one way in which you can say you refute the position, but not because you find some kind of logical flaw in it and say it reduces to a contradiction, or because you say, well, if you don't believe in that, then your mind is going to explode, but simply by saying, look, there are costs and benefits in theoretical terms to this view, and I think in the balance it doesn't come out as strong as others, and I'd rather believe in the existence of other minds than not.
I've always felt that the difference between philosophy and science, if we take Popper's definition of science for the moment, that it's that which is falsifiable, potentially falsifiable statements.
Mm.
Philosophy doesn't contain any potentially falsifiable statements. It's not refutable in that sense. You can only test it through its logical consistency, not through refutation or falsifiability in the scientific sense. And that could be in my view, a demarcation between philosophy and science. Would you go along with that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the difficulty is that the way evidence and beliefs are linked up with one another is, I think, a lot more complex. So the Quine has the metaphor there of the web of belief, right? So the idea is that our beliefs and what we take to be true about the world, and our beliefs about what we perceive and so on. So they are interconnected in a complex web of confirmation and disconfirmation. Yeah, and usually, if you say, okay, so if you get some evidence coming in that contradicts your predictions, you think the experiment should say that, but in fact it says something else, then you're going to adjust your beliefs, right? So this is kind of a falsification route. You make the assumption first, and then you falsify it, you assume the opposite of it, and then you continue. Why do you do that? Well, in order to make the system consistent again, right? So it predicted A, and then you get the data not A. If you take that on as a belief, then you believe in A and not A. That's obviously problematic because you want to be consistent. So because you can't change the input, you're changing the beliefs that you have. So that is basically the falsificationist position. However, what makes it more complicated is in order to ensure consistency in the system, there are all kinds of changes you can make, right? One change you can make is, of course, you say, okay, well, it looks as if the experimental result says that, but I actually don't think that device you're using here is quite reliable. That's a bug, actually. It shouldn't be saying that, right? So we restore consistency by saying, well, that thing is actually a bit dodgy. We need another apparatus, and we try that again, right? Or there are other places within the web of belief that you can tweak in order to restore consistency. Some of these will be extremely eccentric and unattractive. And the extreme that you can see in this conception is, say, if you look at conspiracy theories, right? Whatever evidence you produce, there is a way of immunizing the theory against that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So so to that extent, you can restore consistency no matter what comes in as an information. That is, of course, not a general cognitive strategy either. I mean, what you want is kind of a good balance between taking account of the evidence, but also being aware of the fact that the evidence might be deceptive and that there might be a bug in the apparatus, or you might have set up the experiment in a dodgy way, and that you therefore want to hold on to your theory a little bit longer and don't just ditch it at the first recalcitrant piece of data, right? So to that extent, it's the whole question of whether you regard some data as falsificatory or not is not simply coming from the data saying, okay, so because you've got that data, you have to change your beliefs, but you rather want to say, okay, so how do I balance the entire web of my beliefs in a way that it's both consistent, but also presents the best explanation of the data that are coming in. Yeah.
We're moving here away from Popper towards Thomas Kuhn, aren't we? Because he talks about this whole structure, this web, which you're man, a bit like a paradigm which predisposes your views of the world in a particular way, and it takes a huge shift, sometimes a generational shift, to move away from one picture, one set of beliefs to another set of beliefs. It can be quite revolutionary.
Yeah, that's right. So this is Kuhn Thomas Kuhn is one example, and Paul Feyerabend is another a philosopher of science who were not convinced by this falsificationist picture. I think in general, if you take this kind of web of belief account on board, then you get much closer in the structure to when you compare philosophical theories and scientific theories, because in kind of philosophical theories, there are also particular problems and puzzles you want to solve, right? So you want to, you've got something like the ship of Theseus, is it still the same ship if you replace all the planks?
Yeah.
Or you've got the question, are moral values out there, or is it just what I find disagreeable or agreeable, and so on? So you've got these kind of puzzles or problems, and then you tend to try to come up with a theory that explains them and gives you an answer in one way or another, and does that in a sort of systematic way. And usually there are various theories that can do that, and they often contradict each other. And then how do you pick? Well, the best way of picking is by saying, okay, so for this theory to work, you have to assume A, B, and C, and for that other theory to work, you have to assume D and E and F. And which one do you think is the more attractive package to accept in terms of the theoretical costs that you run by making these assumptions and the explanatory power you gain by solving the puzzles, right? And then it's the question is just not what refutes what, but what overall presents the best deal. And of course, that doesn't mean that there are not a lot of approaches that are ruled out in this way, because often you can say, well, that approach is definitely not as good as that one, so we're not going to take that, but then we have two others here, and that might then be a draw. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in that way, the discussion is a lot more holistic than just saying, okay, which argument is refuted by which other argument.
Okay. Now, I know that you've studied Buddhist teachings quite extensively.
Mhm.
I just wonder, how has that study informed your view of reality, or affected your view of reality?
Right. Well, of course, in Buddhist philosophy, and also in Buddhist philosophy in India, which is mainly what I've worked on in the past, you get all sorts of different views of reality, right? So they don't, even though they're all Buddhists, they don't all have the same philosophical position. Yeah. So you have people who believe that that basically a kind of foundationalism is true, that they're basic objects out of which everything is made. Then you've got others who believe that everything is mental only and everything is only a mental construction. And then you've got a third group of philosophers who think that mind isn't fundamentally real either, but in fact you've got this kind of complex web of things, one thing depending on another, and so there is actually nothing that is substantial or independent, but you've got sort of one complex web of things depending on each other. So I mean, in my study of these systems, I was, first of all, interested in connecting them up with much of the discussion that we find in contemporary metaphysics and epistemology and so on, because it struck me, as certainly as when I started studying these materials, that they were often treated very much in isolation, or were studied primarily from a philological point of view, or from a religious studies point of view, but not so much taking them seriously philosophically and asking yourself, okay, so what are the arguments that these people present, and are the arguments actually good ones, and does the conclusion follow from the premises, and so on. So this is what interested me in working in these materials in the first place, and seeing so how there is actually potential for developing that systematically. And I then got particularly interested in certain ideas of basically non-foundationalist ontologies, which are developed quite extensively in Indian Indian Buddhist philosophical materials and their later Asian successors. And whilst these constitute ideas that you do find to some extent in the Western philosophical tradition, it was never very prominent there. Yeah? And then I thought, okay, so this is quite interesting in terms of developing philosophical positions. Of course, we want to explore all the kind of theoretical possibilities and see, okay, so if something doesn't work, what else could be working? And as such, it struck me that this presents a really interesting alternative way of thinking about phenomena, and something that could well be developed in a purely systematic manner. And so this is partly what I've been trying to do in this the book, The Non-Existence of the Real World, which is really taking some ideas from the Indian philosophical tradition, so in particular a school called Madhyamaka, and trying to develop that in a purely systematic manner. So saying not the justification is that it says something in the text, but you say, okay, we'll start with specific fundamental ideas and then see how we can develop systematic developments of these kinds of conclusions.
And can you summarize the teaching of that Madhyamaka? Is it?
Yeah, so I think the fundamental idea of Madhyamaka is a kind of anti-foundationalism, right? So they argue against the position that there are any entities that exist with intrinsic nature, so things that have their existence, their being, their essence just by themselves without depending on other things, right? So this is relatively close to what in the Western conception you associate with certain ideas of substance, right? So substance, substare, to stand beyond. So it's that kind of stuff which sits at the bottom, and then everything, all the accidents, all the properties and so on, and then build on top of that. Yeah? So if you say there are no substances, then of course you get back to the very problem that we had earlier on. So whether it's either turtles all the way down, or it's some kind of big loop. And so the developing the further consequences of this idea that you don't have a foundation within reality, and you don't have a foundation in epistemology either, so you don't have fundamental or basic beliefs that are not grounded in anything else either. Trying to develop the consequences of that is basically a large part of the systematic development of Madhyamaka thought.
I have only come across one physicist in my own physics background who took Eastern, or let's say that kind of approach seriously. And that was when I did my PhD, which was with David Bohm in Birkbeck College. He used to have lots of discussions with Krishnamurti and others too, and seeking to find some kind of unity of thought between the two, or at least one side informing the other. Would you say that the philosophy, the Buddhist philosophy that you've been thinking, has something specific to add to Western thought that we should take particular notice of?
Yeah, so I mean, there has been a lot more interested in these connections since the times of David Bohm and the Tower of Physics and all of these kind of earlier works. I mean, one example, I've got that right here, is Carlo Rovelli, Helgoland.
I've got that book.
You've got that book, and then
did a brief review of it on YouTube.
Exactly, and then you'll realize that in chapter 5, there is a section called Without Foundations, Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna is, of course, the founder of the school of Madhyamaka that we've just been talking about. And so Ravelli is looking at the extent to which this kind of relationism, which he is interested in quantum physics, can be related to Nagarjuna's idea that you don't have any substances, right? So there you have an interesting dialogue there. That is, of course, not to say that they've already discovered quantum physics in second century India. That would be absurd. The idea is rather that we are looking for theoretical models in order to explain stuff that we want to explain now by looking at intellectual traditions. And so this is what he's doing there. Another good example where these connections are explored is a French physicist called Michel Bitbol. He's published mainly in French, not so much in English, but he has also presented quite a lot of interesting material in looking at the interconnection between these Madhyamaka ideas that we've been talking about and quantum physics. So again, I think why this is interesting is not some kind of philosophy science vindication where you say, okay, well, the scientists say it too, and therefore the philosophy must be true. It's rather the idea that you get specific philosophical perspectives in these texts that might help you in order to generate a kind of theoretical framework to explain what you want to explain now. And that is, I think, is interesting. And if it's done in a responsible way, also quite illuminating.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time together, yeah. But I wanted to ask you, if I may, one last question, which is more focused on your particular thoughts. Having studied many of these different ideas now, what is Jan Westerhoff's view or conception of reality, as close as you can define it?
Right. I
Put you
think.
on the spot a little bit, I'm afraid.
No. I think of course the short answer, it's a lot more complicated than we have thought. I mean, I don't want to pretend that I've figured it all out already, and that would be a little bit boring, perhaps, because then what else am I going to do with the rest of my life? Um, so I mean, what I think has emerged from this, from the discussion that we had so far, is that um, there are a lot more theoretical options out there about what kind of structure reality could have, and some of them are really underexplored and deserve a lot more airtime in seeing how they might be able to solve the theoretical puzzles that we are interested in.
Yes, but let me pin you down, fella. What of those particular models would you choose
All
if
right.
you were forced to make a choice as to this is what I think reality is really at? It's either all mind or it's all materialism or it's neither one nor the other or it's interactionism between the two or it's I don't know. What would you say is your closest understanding of what reality really comes down to?
Okay. So
Is there such a thing?
yeah, no, okay. This is, I think there are two parts to the answer of this question. So the first is, of course, that if you assume that there are no ultimately real objects, then there is also a good case to be made that there are no ultimate truth either, right?
Right.
And so to that extent, if you the question, what do you think is really real, or what's the final answer, or what is the ultimate truth of the ontological structure of reality, also presupposes that there is such a thing and that there are specific facts about those. And if you deny that, then the whole question is unfounded. Okay, so that was the first part. Now, the second part is, however, if you think, okay, so taking that into account and without assuming that any um, of these models are reflective of the way reality is fundamentally, which one do you think is the best in terms of comparison with all the others? And there, I would say, well, remember we talked about the triad of foundationalism, dependence all the way down, and the circular system. Is the what I'd be most interested in, and I think has the most theoretical potential, is the final one, is the circular structure, where you have an ontology of entities that are interconnected in a web of dependence, and where they depend on one another, where not necessarily everything depends on everything else, but everything depends on some other thing. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that is what my best bet would be.
That's a kind of bootstrap argument that everything pulls itself up into
That's right.
reality.
That's right.
Jan Westerhoff, thank you very much indeed for your time today and a probing into what reality may or may not be. But thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Philip, for inviting me. I really enjoyed the conversation.